Hi! In this video, you're watching a recording of our live webinar, How to Make a Retirement Income Plan, where we walk through the critical steps that it takes to lay out an income timeline, where is your cash flow going to come from in retirement, an expense timeline, what are you going to spend, how much you'll need to withdraw from savings and investments each year, and a series of tests that can help you make sure it's all sustainable. And don't forget to stay till the very end. All of our live attendees ask us lots of questions and answers, and we try to stay on and answer every single one.
The topic of today's webinar is how to make a retirement income plan. Before we get started, though, a few words about our firm for those not familiar. Dana Anspaugh, the founder and CEO of Sensible Money, set out to create a firm focused on retirement planning and more specifically, the most challenging phase of living off your acorns. Over the years, she has earned a reputation as one of the country's leading experts on the topic of retirement income sustainability. Dana is the author of the widely acclaimed retirement guide, Control Your Retirement Destiny. Her online course, How to Plan the Perfect Retirement, is available at thegreatcourses.com. And something she'll talk about more during the webinar. Sensible Money has recently launched a podcast and a YouTube channel called Making Retirement Make Sense, which you can find through the address there on the screen at Making Retirement Make Sense. Dana's hosting this webinar, in fact, from inside the new studio. Last year, Sensible Money was ranked #1 in Arizona and 16th in the nation for firms with assets between $500 million and $1 billion, and ranked 81st among all firms nationwide by USA Today. No surprise to any of us who work at Sensible Money, we've again been named a best place to work for financial advisors by Investment News. I'm Nancy Fellinger. I'm one of the financial planners here at Sensible Money, and I'm based in South Carolina. Our headquarters are in Arizona, but we also have team members in several other states. And using the same technology that we use here, we work seamlessly with each other and with clients all across the country. You've already seen the chat box in your GoToMeeting screen, and we want to encourage you to add any questions to it as we go. There will be time at the end for questions, and Dana will answer as many of them as possible. We are recording the webinar, and we'll follow up with a link to it within the next several days. So now let's turn it over to Dana to get started.
Thank you, Nancy. And Nancy, let me check with you first. Can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Fantastic. And for the audience out there, one more time, if we can just have you put a quick yes into the question box. I'm already seeing some thumbs up. I love emojis, so that works. Fantastic. Well, I think we are off and running. And before we get started on this topic of how to make a retirement income plan, we do need to cover our standard disclosures. We always walk through examples and try to make a composite of different scenarios we've seen. Of course, nothing that we show can be a guarantee of a positive outcome. Retirement planning is very specific to your personal circumstances, to market conditions. And so nothing we're illustrating is meant to promise performance or provide any guarantees. I'm sure you all know all of that, but we do have to put it in writing and make sure that we say it. So with that covered, let's talk about our agenda today. We're going to lay out basically a 5-part plan on how to make a retirement income plan. For those of you who have seen this webinar before, and we know we have many repeat attendees, which we very much appreciate, I do try to change it up each time. So the order that we're covering some of these things may be a little different. The exact order doesn't matter as much as making sure that all the critical components are covered. And it's a very iterative process. So there are many times where we get to one step and then we have to go back to a previous step or cycle through, because every single thing we change impacts almost every other thing in the plan. So don't think of this as a prescribed order as much as here's one way of walking through the various steps that you have to cover when you are making a well-designed and sustainable retirement income plan. We're going to walk through these steps by using a case study. So we're going to be talking about a hypothetical couple, Wally and Sally. They are age 64 and 61 in this current calendar year. 2026 is the calendar year we're starting their plan or projection in. Both plan to retire. This is the last year of work for both. Neither has started Social Security yet, and Sally has a certain type of deferred comp plan. Now, there are several types of deferred comp plans out there. Some function a little bit more like a 401k plan, where you have an account balance that you can tap into at almost any time. Other types of plans have a specified payout structure. So when you put the money into the deferred comp plan, you are also choosing when that money is going to come back out, what calendar year, over what time frame. That is the type of plan that Sally has, and it will pay out for 5 years starting the year after she retires. And there are some very strategic decisions you can make. So if you have a deferred comp plan, one of the mistakes that we see are that people will simply choose a lump sum distribution for the year they retire or the year after they retire. And sometimes that can cause a tax bomb, a lot of taxable income coming into a single calendar year. Whereas if they strategically laid out when they wanted those distributions to occur in alignment with a bigger and broader projection model, it can make the outcome a little smoother. It can help reduce risk. It can smooth out the tax impact. So just something to be aware of if you have a deferred comp plan. Now, when we look at the net worth statement for Wally and Sally, we are talking about a high net worth couple. We do see a lot more of this in our practice. But if you have less than $1 million, even only a couple $100,000 saved, the process is the same. So you could divide all of these numbers by 4, just take a fraction. The process that we use to lay everything out, to test, to make sure it's going to work, to look at your income, look at your expenses, look at your withdrawal plan, that's going to stay the same regardless of the size of your assets. Unless, of course, you're a Jeff Bezos and if you're lucky enough to be on that end, you're probably not watching this webinar, but then the process, of course, would change a bit. So when we're looking at Wally and Sally, you can see the first column, Wally has IRAs and an inherited IRA, and it is about 5 years in. It's got 5 more years that it has to pay out. Sally, I'll explain what that is when we get there. Sally has IRAs, 401ks, and we see the balance of her deferred comp plan. But this is something you have to think about too when you have assets that are going to pay out as an income stream. Do you include them as a lump sum, just like you would an account in your modeling, or do you include them as a stream of income? And in this case, we are including it here on the net worth statement, but in their actual projection model, it's going to be shown as a cash flow stream. We won't include the lump sum balance. And that's something that we see can come up when there are annuities, when there are pension plans. Sometimes pension plans will also show you an account balance, and you can't include both. So there's times where we see people make errors in their own modeling where they're including both the balance and the income stream, and then you would be double counting that asset. So for each asset, you have to decide how you're going to include it in the plan, one way or the other. It's a lump sum balance available for a varying rate of return, or it is a cash flow stream, but not both. We also see that they have a primary residence and they have a small mortgage, about $96,000 left on that. That will be paid off if they continue with their payments at the end of next year. So part 1, what Wally and Sally need to do is outline their desired spending. And we start with something we call an expense timeline. Now, there's this balance between how much can you spend today and how do you preserve enough so that the 85-year-old you still has sufficient assets and a sufficient amount to cover potential later life healthcare needs. You might have to move in later life. So that's that balance we're always trying to find. And we do that by way of adjusting assumptions, as I mentioned, using a very iterative process, and using a set of retirement readiness tests that we'll illustrate at the end. And with each change we make, we can see the impact on those retirement readiness tests. And that also allows us to build in some of the extras for the 65-year-old you. So we'll talk about that. We talk about the phases of retirement and perhaps that there should be, or there may be, have the means to be able to have extra spending in those early retirement years while still making sure there's enough for the later you. Now, when we lay that out, spending while we're working, it's often we have a paycheck coming in, we budget out of that. But if we also have bonuses at the end of the year or stock options, things that are bringing lump sum cash flows into our plan, we may be using those to pay for extras. That may be how we fund a vacation. That may be how you're buying your next car. Well, in retirement, you're not going to have necessarily the bonus at the quarterly end of the quarter or at the end of the year. You're not necessarily going to have stock options once they've been exercised that can cover those. So you have to model those things out a little more carefully. And we think of it in terms of what are your fixed expenses? Something like a mortgage is fixed, but that expense doesn't inflate. So if you still have a mortgage going into retirement and it has 10 or 15 years on it, well, that is a fixed expense. However, the property taxes and homeowners insurance associated with it will inflate. So we want to break those two expenses apart when we're modeling them out. One that's fixed, one that will continue to inflate. Then you have all your recurring expenses. We think of these as your living expenses, your utilities, your cell phone bill, gas, groceries, maybe it's a gym membership, your health insurance, and of course, taxes. Taxes are a recurring expense and they will continue in retirement, but the way you have to pay them will change. Now, in the recurring expenses, there's also eating out and entertainment. But those expenses may actually decline throughout the later years of retirement. So we'll be talking about that also. Then you have annual expenses, and these are the ones that we see sometimes people forget to model. This can be things like a periodic car purchase. Some people leading up to retirement try to buy their last car, but it probably won't be your last car purchase. And so there will be lump sums throughout retirement for these things. And then there's property taxes. If your mortgage is paid off, those will happen either annually or semi-annually. There's insurance premiums. Oftentimes those are set up on an annual payment. And so you have to account for those in your budget, and they don't come in on a monthly basis. So when will they happen? If it's property taxes, it can be pretty large. Sometimes we have clients that will take a monthly distribution from their portfolio, and then twice a year we will have a lump sum set just to cover some of the larger expenses, periodic expenses like property taxes. And then here in the annual expenses, travel, not necessarily annual, but usually you will have an annual travel budget. And that's one of those things that may decline over time. And then I guess under annual and periodic, I kind of lumped those together as I was talking, but you'll have auto purchases, dental expenses. If you're a higher net worth household, those may not seem like a lot, but I can remember when I had my first crown done and I was newer in my career, and for those on a tighter budget, that can be a catastrophic expense. It can be devastating to think, oh my gosh, I have to pay $2,000, or in dental, it can be even more today, $5,000 for this dental expense that is not in my budget anywhere. And so you do want to have reserves set aside to cover some of these things. It can be significant auto repairs and major home repairs, particularly if you have an older home. Maybe the roof is going to need to be redone, the electrical or the plumbing. I'm dealing with that in a house that I have right now, where everything is 40 years old and it's all falling apart at once. Those are going to be some pretty major expenses that you're going to have to account for. And then under periodic, I also have the what ifs. There's not been hardly a single retiree that we've worked with who hasn't suddenly said, well, what if we want to move to a age 55 plus community? What if we want to move to live closer to one of our adult children? What if we want to move to live in this other state? Or we've even had ones look at going to live in another country. Portugal has been popular lately, and I'd like to go live there for a few years. Or, well, now that I'm retired, I really would like to have this condo here and maybe this house in the mountains here. And so there's all kinds of what ifs that show up that maybe weren't part of your plan, but now you want to know, can I afford to do this? Would this work? How would I cover these expenses? So when we're modeling all of those in, we also think of the phases of retirement. The pre-go phase, I think of that as the 10 years leading up to retirement. This is where you lay the critical foundation for a successful retirement. The planning you do in this pre-go phase really has a huge impact on how you feel, the level of safety and peace of mind you feel as you transition into retirement, and can set the stage to have a smooth transition where you're not stressed out. Then you have, I have my phases in the wrong order here. So we have the pre-go phase, then comes the go-go phase, and that's usually the first 10 years of retirement where you're traveling, you're healthy, you want to be out and about doing things, and expenses often peak. There's perhaps more entertaining, more flying to see family, more having family fly to see you, or if you're a solo, just simply more traveling, getting out to see the world. Then you enter your slow go phase, and that's often where spending naturally declines. It's not that a light bulb comes on and says, well, you're in the slow go phase. It happens just organically. People, they're not eating out as much, they're not traveling as much, and they're not upset about it. They're often, just we're happy being at home right now. We're happy with our routine. So things just our acceptance of things changes. And then the no-go phase is where often healthcare issues take precedence. Perhaps we need some accommodations in our house that we need to make to be able to get around. Perhaps we need someone to come into the home and help us out. We just may need more assistance. It might need somebody helping with the yard, with the cleaning, with the cooking, or it could be that phase where we need to find assisted living, or if you're married, one half of a couple needs to find assisted living. And so those things are things you want to plan for when you're in the go, or not in the go-go phase, when you're in the slow-go phase. So if you wait to plan for the no-go phase until you're there, oftentimes your mental capacity to deal with all of the decisions and the complexity isn't what it used to be. So you really want to plan ahead and have an outline of what you want to do before you need to make those decisions. So let's take a look at what this looks like for Wally and Sally. Here we have a spreadsheet. I know it looks super tiny on the screen, so I'm going to attempt to zoom in here. And let's see if I can zoom without messing it up. Yay, I think I did it. So at the top, you're going to see horizontally the number of years and the calendar year and their age at year end. And then down the left-hand side, you'll see the different categories. This is their expense timeline. We see primary residence mortgage. And here, let me get my laser pointer back if it'll work. Oh, my laser pointer will not work while I'm on Zoom. So I'm going to stay zoomed and we'll lose the laser pointer. So you're going to see your primary residence mortgage going across at about $50,400, and we see that that's paid off in 2 years. So Wally and Sally want to know, should we pay that off before we retire? We know it's only a year, but what might that look like? We have home taxes and insurance underneath, and we can see that that expense is rising each year from $6,000 to, by 2028, almost $6,250. We have home upkeep and repairs, just a baseline number for minor repairs, and we see that is inflating. And then we have living expenses, and those are also going up. Now, we're using a 2% inflation rate on these living expenses for Wally and Sally, and there's a reason for that. Research shows that the higher level of spending that you have in retirement, the less your income needs to go up with inflation. So there's often just wiggle room. They find that, yes, even higher net worth households do need their income to rise, but not at the same pace as inflation. So if inflation was 3%, here we're saying, well, a reasonable expectation is that living expenses would need to rise by 2%. But if we're looking at a lower income, lower net worth household, spending is typically under $100,000 a year, then we might default to that 3% because basics like gas, groceries, certainly we've seen those prices increase quite a bit recently. Utility bills, those are going to take a much bigger bite out of a budget for somebody that is a lower income household. So those inflation assumptions get customized by the demographics of the actual household. Then we see our first auto purchase out here in 2028. And if I scroll out here, we see a second auto purchase, $60,000 out here in 2031. And we have those auto purchases staggered out throughout retirement. This household typically pays cash for their cars. We're assuming there's a trade-in on the previous car. And we're assuming that because of inflation, to own the same type of car, it gets a little bit more expensive over time. Now, perhaps in 20 years, we'll all be using the, robo-taxis. We don't know. But right now, we built the auto purchases in there. Then we see charity. And they are charitably inclined. They do regular tithing to both a religious organization and some other causes they care about. And so we have a baseline of charity built in, and we'll see that disappears out here. And why would that disappear? Well, at that point, they are eligible to do charitable donations, something called a qualified charitable donation, out of their IRA. And so rather than budgeting for that out of your regular after-tax cash flow, we switch to a slightly more tax-efficient way of making those same donations directly from the IRA, at which point that begins now at age 70 and a half is when you can actually begin those charitable contributions from your IRA. We also see a travel budget here that is inflating over time. We see out-of-pocket healthcare expenses. Let me get back to my labels here. Then we see health insurance premiums. So those are going to be out-of-pocket premiums prior to going on Medicare. Then when they go on Medicare, they are going to be using a supplemental Medicare plan along with traditional Medicare. And then they will have their Part B and D premiums. So you see those Part B and D premiums. And why do those vary so much? Well, Part B and D premiums are means tested. So the Social Security Administration looks at your tax return 2 years prior, and that determines what your upcoming Part B and D premiums will be. About 5% of the population is subject to what's called IRMA, the Income-Related Monthly Adjustment Amount, meaning they will pay higher premiums than the baseline. Now, if you just retired, there is one of 7 reasons that you can ask for a reconsideration. You can say, you know what, those higher premiums, yes, that was my income 2 years ago while I was working, but my income now is lower. And so you can ask the Social Security Administration to reconsider that. There's a form that you fill out. We fill those out oftentimes for many clients at the beginning of the year, asking for those premiums to come down. But in this scenario, we modeled out the premiums automatically based on what their income was 2 years prior. We also now see taxes. And while they're working, of course, there's the Medicare surtax and FICA taxes. Those are the taxes that come out of our paychecks. But we also see this net investment income tax. So that can be something that adds an extra 3.8% to some retirees who have higher net worths. And we're seeing it's not much, but it does impact Wally and Sally. And then we're seeing federal and state taxes. And in this scenario, we have some Roth conversions built in. So those federal and state taxes are a little bit higher than they would be if we had not built in those Roth conversions. But we wanted to even out their tax rate throughout retirement. And taxes have to be part of that expense timeline. And that's where it becomes very iterative. I have to know what account I'm going to tap and what the tax implications are in order to actually budget for taxes. And what I really want to solve for is what is the amount of spending that you will be able to have after taxes. We want that to be consistent. We don't want to say, well, I took the money from the IRA, so I have $20,000 less to spend this year because that IRA distribution was taxable. And so this is where the process iterates, where we may say, okay, we're going to need to take this much out of the IRA. We have to plug that withdrawal in first to calculate the taxes to make sure that we've taken out enough to maintain the after-tax monthly living expense that someone wants to have in retirement. And then at the bottom, we see this total outflows in this peach color, where we're totaling all of the household expenses, plus all of the taxes that we estimate they will have, plus any lump sum payments, such as the travel or the auto purchases. And so we can see that spending can vary from a high of $291, and then the next year, because there isn't an auto purchase, it goes down to about $244. And if I scroll out in time, we can see again a year where it's $249, and then it bumps up to $315. We have another auto purchase happening that year. And so we think of expenses as this linear, predictable path, but it's usually not. Things come up in retirement. People want a gift. They have grandchildren. They want to fund 529 plans. They decide that they want to move because now they have the free time and the capacity to even think about this. Where they were working, it was heads down. I just can't even really think yet about what that might look like. So all kinds of things come up that we have to plan for. And here we can lay it out, and we see most frequently that those expenses aren't the same every single year. The totals can vary, sometimes by a large amount from year to year. And so that can make it difficult to follow something like the 4% rule, because that's not how we spend, right? We don't spend a linear amount every single year. And so we want to model that out and make sure that the portfolio is lined up with that. This is a sample of the first 10 years of what Wally and Sally's expense timeline might look like. And as I mentioned, part of those expenses is accounting for taxes. And so here's a peek into what their tax timeline looks at. Now, this is the part that can be difficult to do. Some software does a pretty good job of it. People will often ask us on these webinars, how come you use spreadsheets? Well, this is really more than that. This is a whole robust model. And we have found, and we go out to market and test the available software packages all the time, that we can't see behind the scenes into what's really happening. And we find that frustrating. We need to be able to answer very detailed questions, and we want to be able to see the data. We also want all of our planners who are highly trained to not just be like, well, the software says that. They want to know, we want them to know why. Like, why are the taxes higher this year? And when you use software, it can often be difficult to trace that back to what's actually happening. Whereas the way we do it, we have a tremendous amount of transparency into the data and what is actually happening under the hood. And so we know why this number is higher or lower and what factors to adjust if we want it to change. But here we're seeing this tax timeline. And again, I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to try to zoom. Oops. Try to zoom in here. I got it. Yes. And so a couple of key things. We see estimated adjusted gross income. And by the way, there are many different versions of modified adjusted gross income. There's one version that determines your Medicare Part B and D premiums. That is not always the same as adjusted gross income that you're seeing here. So for example, if you have a brokerage account that owns municipal bonds, municipal bond interest may not be taxed as a federal tax item, but it is an add back tax item to calculate your total modified adjusted gross income for your Part B and D premiums. So there's a different modified adjusted gross income calculation that determines if you're eligible for healthcare tax credits. So just know I'm using adjusted gross income here, but there are numerous versions of it depending on what formula of the tax code we're talking about. Then we see below the line deductions. So we're using standardized deductions here, and they get the charitable deduction for non-itemizers. That's a new aspect of the tax code that began last year. Because Wally has his last year of self-employment consulting income, he also has a qualified business income deduction. And so we're factoring that in. We have come across clients where that deduction was missed on their tax return. We've been able to ask them to go back and have their accounting firm amend that. Doesn't happen too often, but just know if you're self-employed, there could be some extra deductions there available to you. And we have estimated taxable income. That taxable income is what flows through the tax chart. So where we see tax rates, in this case, top marginal rate of 24% or 22 or 12, well, it's the taxable income that flows into that. And under the hood are a couple different components, because if we go back up to their income here, we see ordinary income, and then we see net long-term gains and qualified dividends. So long-term capital gains and qualified dividends have their own tax tier that they flow into. So this income goes through this deductions that are out here, and then we get taxable income, and depending on the character of that taxable income, it's going to flow into either the capital gains tax tier or the ordinary income tax tier. This is another thing that makes it iterative. Suppose Wally and Sally have an appreciated stock or an S&P 500 index fund that has substantial gains in it, and that's what they plan to sell to fund their living expenses their first year in retirement. Well, in that case, this net long-term gains number is going to be much higher. That is going to impact the total federal tax that we expect they will pay. Now, we like to go in and plan what types of withdrawals will come out of which account. So if we know we're going to be realizing capital gains, we want to add that in so it becomes part of the long-term plan. And so then down here, we see some of the details. Ordinary income tax, what part of the tax it comes from qualified dividends, what part of the tax comes from net investment income tax, and then self-employment tax. Now here we see their top marginal rate, and underneath we see something called the effective rate. Marginal rate means the very top tier of my income, what part of the tax schedule did that flow into? An effective rate basically says, let's look at my total taxes divided by my income. And it's one of the things where, as professionals, we sometimes paraphrase or we try to say something to make it sound simple. And so we'll talk about filling up a tax rate. And we think of it as, okay, can I fill up this 24 or 22% tax rate if I think they will be in a higher tax rate later, or if there's room in, for example, the 12 to 22% rate, should I just fill it up now? It's actually not quite what we're doing, but that's the easiest way to explain it. In reality, you're looking at this effective rate out here and going, okay, if this is around 17%, if I were to scroll out in time and say, well, here it's only going to be 15%, then are there ways that I would want to shift income from today's higher rates to lower rates later, even though the marginal rate is the same, 22% throughout this decade? And so those are some of the things under the hood that we are trying to look at to even out those tax rates. In this case, this plan already has a basic layer of tax management put in place with the Roth conversions to try to say, okay, I want to fill up some of these lower tax rate years with Roth conversions. That's already built into the model. So, combined with their living expense timeline, and then you've seen what I call the under the hood of their tax timeline, those are the two things that make up planning out expenses. And I like the timeline format again because expenses don't always occur evenly each year. Another example of how expenses might change, you may have children that are in college or in their last few years of high school and planning to go to college. And so you may have expenses for those children for several more years. We've had many households where we plan those into the budget, but then those are going to drop off. And so that makes it easier when we've accounted for that to look at what will you actually need in retirement once you aren't covering the expenses for these children. Hopefully you reach that point. If you don't have children, you may not have that aspect of it, but there may be extra travel that you want to do in retirement. Next, we want to look at calculating the fixed income. And again, you could do this in reverse, right? You could calculate the fixed income portion of the plan first and then move into the expenses. We like to start with the expenses because that's what we're solving for. We're solving for a lifestyle, right? People want to know, hey, I'm working right now. Would I be able to maintain this similar lifestyle throughout retirement? Do I have a reasonable expectation that this would work? And if I can't, what adjustments would I have to make? So now we're moving into the fixed income. And in this case, we're using an income timeline. We see, again, I'm going to blow this up. We see Wally and Sally's income during their last year of work is $305,000. And we're going to use a delay Social Security strategy. There's a different software program that those numbers were run through. And so out here in time, we see that Wally would be filing at age 70 and Sally would be filing at 68. Weird age, right? I know we often talk about full retirement age, which is 67 for most people today. And then, 70 is when you get your maximum benefit. There is no point in delaying past then. And then we might have early claiming at 62. But why 68? Well, when we run the numbers out in the software, it gives us the mathematical answer based on their life expectancy that should give them the most benefits over that particular time frame. And in this case, that mathematical present value number worked out to be a claiming plan where Wally files at 70 and Sally files at 68. Now, in reality, there might be some reasons we would adjust that. If Sally had any health issues, then maybe her claiming age would move up. Or if they both said, we expect both of us are going to be really healthy, we might move Sally's claiming age back to 70 because Social Security does something unique in your plan. It offers a longevity hedge. It offers inflation-adjusted income for the rest of your life. And for married couples, it offers a survivor benefit. The person with the highest benefit amount, that becomes a survivor benefit for the longest spouse to live. There's been a lot of press and a lot of headlines we saw in the last 6 months on whether you should claim Social Security early. And we do believe it is a customized decision. It should be made at the individual level. But for couples, there are strong, compelling reasons for that person who has the highest benefit to delay until 70. And we feel like a lot of the articles and perhaps blogs that we're reading aren't really making that point as well as I wish they would, because Social Security does something unique. You shouldn't compare it to an investment. It doesn't do what an investment does. It's inflation adjusted. It's for the rest of your life. It is a very unique factor in your financial plan. And clearly, I get passionate about that because I know the difference it can make for households when they make a claiming decision that really meets their parameters. So for Wally and Sally, we have this gap. So we're going to have to cover everything that they need from their portfolio. Excuse me. For these 1, 2, 3, 6 years. And then we have Social Security coming in. So they'll have a baseline of guaranteed income here. Now, Sally also has a deferred comp plan, and we'll look at that. We are using the deferred comp plan as a cash flow stream later, but we didn't put it up here because it's not quite guaranteed. It is invested, and so the exact amount of cash flow that Sally gets from that deferred comp plan, we know it will pay out over 5 years. We don't have a lot of control over the investments within it, but it's still not guaranteed like Social Security's. Excuse me. It's still not guaranteed like Social Security is. So here we chose to just look at the fixed income, the Social Security they have, and then determine the gap. And that's what comes next. Now, the gap is what we think of the difference. We have what we want to spend, our outline spending, including we had to account for taxes. And then we have the fixed guaranteed sources coming in, which in this case was just Social Security. But for some households, we see a pension in there. Sometimes we see retirement income. And then there's some discussion on whether we put that into the guaranteed category or not. Sometimes we see annuity income, if that's an annuity that pays out for life or if it has the ability to turn that feature on. But for Wally and Sally, it's just Social Security. And so we need to look at the gap. And if I go back for a second, we see Wally and Sally's total fixed income here is in this light blue color. And if you remember, their total expenses were in that peach color. And so when I look at these two together, we see the light blue, that's their fixed income coming in. We see the peach color, that's their desired spending, including taxes going out. And we see either a deposit or a withdrawal each year. So in the first year, Wally and Sally have $33,000 more coming in than they have going out. That's how Wally and Sally have gotten to where they are today. Their income was higher than their expenses, so they were able to save. And so we see that in their last year of work. Starting next year, we see, okay, to cover all of our lifestyle plus taxes, we would need to withdraw $284,000 from our portfolio savings and investment assets. And then we can see how that gap changes from year to year. Higher during years with auto purchases, lower during years without. And then it goes down out here as Social Security kicks in. So we're going to need that portfolio to sustain a higher level of withdrawal in these early years. And then once those guaranteed sources of income come in, the drawdown rate on that portfolio will go down. Another reason why we're not huge fans of a static rate like the 4% rule, because that wouldn't allow for this plan. And in reality, this plan works perfectly well. And so if we were limiting ourselves to a specific withdrawal percentage, we might say, oh my gosh, Wally and Sally, you're going to have to work longer or we're going to have to claim Social Security earlier. But none of those things are what makes their plan more secure or potentially more stable, more reliable. And so this way of doing it works better over their entire lifetime. We have higher withdrawals early, lower withdrawals later on in their plan. Now that we have the gap, we have to look at how do we cover that gap? And back to our iterative process, we want to look at how we cover it in the most tax efficient way possible. Now, I say most tax efficient. We never can get that down to absolutely, this was the most tax efficient. So we call it tax managed. Is there a way that we can manage the taxes over their lifetime to potentially reduce that lifetime tax burden? That doesn't always mean paying the least amount of taxes this year. Sometimes the decisions that can help reduce your tax burden over a 20 or 30-year time horizon are decisions that mean paying a little bit more this year. And so all of that is factored in by using both the marginal rate and that effective tax rate that we looked at. And so that happens behind the scenes where we then come up with a withdrawal plan. And again, we have a big spreadsheet with lots of numbers because we want to be able to see every single piece of it to really understand it. And so I'm going to zoom in again. So we have Wally and Sally, and down the left-hand side, we have all of the different account types. And this is something we see quite a bit. People will have multiple account types. Wally and Sally have a deferred comp plan. Wally has his traditional retirement account, 401k rolled to an IRA and an inherited IRA. Sally has her traditional workplace retirement plan. They each have Roth IRAs. They have a non-retirement account. We call them NRAs, a brokerage account with investments in it. And they have health savings accounts. So there has to be a separate withdrawal plan for each account. And of course, each one has different tax implications. So as we zoom in, we're going to look at how that gap is going to be covered. Well, in year one of retirement, Sally's deferred comp plan has an expected payout of about $106,000. We're going to be doing a Roth conversion for Wally's IRA. So that's behind the scenes. It's shown as a withdrawal, but it's not. But it is a withdrawal from the IRA. We'll see it as we scroll down as a deposit into the Roth. And then we have this inherited IRA. So Wally has to take out minimum distributions from his inherited IRA. And then by year 10, that has to come out as a lump sum. And so we see $90,000 coming out of that a few years into the plan because it has to. Now, this is where everything factors together. If we know that this lump sum is going to be coming out of the inherited IRA, well, there's less Roth conversion that year for Wally because we can only have so much taxable income flowing into the plan to fill up those tax brackets that year. So knowing the inherited IRA distribution schedule allows us to plan around it. Same up here with Sally, knowing this distribution schedule for her deferred comp plan. We have 1, 2, 5 years, and then it's paid out. Well, we have to plan around that because every dollar that comes out of that deferred comp plan is taxable income to Wally and Sally. So we've looked at her deferred comp distributions, Wally's traditional pre-tax asset distributions. Then we have Sally. We don't have anything coming out of her retirement accounts in this first 10 years. And that's because her RMDs, required minimum distributions, don't begin until age 75. Now, up here, however, we do see this small amount starting to come out of Wally when he turns 70. Those are qualified charitable distributions. And so when those come directly from the IRA, they are not taxable income, nor do they show up as part of those modified adjusted gross income calculations. That's why we really like doing charitable contributions directly from the IRA once you're eligible to do them. And so that's why you're seeing these distributions show up out of Wally's account when he turns 70 and a half. At that point, Sally is not yet 70 and a half, so she is not yet eligible to do those qualified charitable distributions. We come down to Wally's Roth, and we see the Roth conversions being deposited, and so his Roth balance is growing. And we see Sally's Roth also. Now, we specifically chose Roth conversions for Wally because he's the oldest of the two. So we wanted to reduce the required minimum distributions that would hit him first. And so it's in some cases, we have spouses that want to do them evenly. We like to do them strategically if there is a reason to do one versus the other based on age differences. We also find Roth conversions don't always make as much sense for singles. Now, that's not a never. So if you are single listening to this, don't rule them out. You could still have some gap years where your taxes are much lower, where they absolutely do make sense. But if you have some baseline income like a pension or a deferred comp plan coming in, there are many cases where we say for singles, they don't make as much sense. And I know on our Making Retirement Make Sense We have case studies going up on our new YouTube channel. One of our partners and planners, Amy Shepard, has done one where she looks at this example of where Roth conversions do not make sense. We talk about them a lot because they're a cool strategy, but they don't always make sense. And then we have these non-retirement accounts here. Now, in this case, most of these assets came from an inheritance that Wally and Sally had. And so there's not a lot of embedded tax implications in them, which means that we can take some chunks out of here and not have a lot of extra taxes. And we see that we're intentionally spending this non-retirement account down in their first 10 years of retirement. And then the distributions will switch toward required distributions from the IRAs. That is not always the most optimal strategy, just happened to be what works for this household. Now, one of the iterative things is, let's say instead that this $700,000, $800,000 that Wally and Sally have in their brokerage account was all an S&P 500 fund, or it was their company stock that had done exceptionally well. Well, that would be a different thing we would have to account for. We would have to account for the fact that if we sold $173,000, maybe, I've seen cases where nearly all of that would be taxable if the asset has appreciated enough, or at least half of it would be taxable. So we would have to be building in $80,000 to $85,000 of realized capital gains that would then be subject to the capital gains tax rate in order to accurately factor in what they're going to need after taxes. In this case, in this scenario, that was not the case. Now, when we get down here in this yellow, we're seeing this 284, 291, 244. Well, if I go back a few slides, that is going to match exactly our gap. So we know what our gap is, what needs to come from savings and investments, and we've taken it down to the individual account level to outline exactly how we're going to fill that gap and what account it's going to come from. Now, one of the things here we have are health savings accounts. Technically, Wally and Sally could probably fund these accounts for a few more years until they're 65. You don't have to have earned income to fund a health savings account. You do have to have earned income to make Roth contributions, but not for Roth conversions. I just clarify that because that comes up often in various chat groups and in client questions. So in reality, probably sometime, past the first 10 years, we would add in a health savings account distribution plan. They are not an efficient asset to pass along to heirs, whereas Roth IRAs are. And so it can be good to plan out how and when you're going to use those health savings accounts. I like to use them for higher net worth households to cover those Part B and D premiums, maybe starting around age 70, planning to empty out the health savings account by the early 80s. And so that's something to consider if that is an account type that you have. Now, if Wally and Sally follow this plan, what does it look like? Well, for those of us who are visual, here is their different account types represented by the different colors. If you see something like that yellow color that seems to just kind of drop off the screen, well, that is Wally's Roth IRA. We assume Wally passed away at 85, and then that becomes Sally's Roth IRA. So it just becomes the light blue color. The account doesn't just vanish or disappear. But there are cases where we've had second marriages where certain accounts were set to go to the next generation, where we did have to factor that into the plan to say, well, this asset is available while the two of you are together. However, when one person passes, this amount of assets will no longer be part of the plan. So we have to test for that. And we do have the ability to do that. But here we see that their trajectory is maintained. So they maintain about the same amount of assets that they retire with throughout this plan. And that looks pretty solid. Now, there are a couple ways that we will stress test that, and we'll look at that in a minute. Sometimes we have people who look at this type of trajectory and go, well, I want to die with $1 in the bank. Can you make that happen? And we can do our best, but we would have to know exactly the timing of that. And that's a hard thing to know. But we do have an ongoing process of testing where every year if someone's ahead of plan, we can say, yes, there's room to do these extra things, or there's, room to take the family on a trip, or there's room to buy that condo that you've been thinking about. So that becomes an annual iterative process of testing and seeing if those things are possible. But this looks solid. Wally and Sally feel pretty comfortable with this. And so kind of zooming out for a second, let's look at how all of this fits together in somewhat of a summary screen. And again, I'll zoom in so you can see this a little better. But now we're looking at the same data, but it's in a vertical format, which sometimes it can make it easier depending on how your brain works. My brain likes to see it in every way possible. That helps me. But here, this vertical view can help you see how it all fits together. So scrolling in, down the left-hand side, we again have the number of years and the calendar year. And on the top, we see the non-investment income. So this is their earned income, and then we see Social Security, not by person, but combined for the two of them, and how that kicks in out here in 2032. So here we have their total not fixed income sources, in earned income and Social Security. Then we see how it's being supplemented with withdrawals from the account. This is section B. So Wally's pre-tax accounts, well, we're not planning on tapping those for about 7 years. Wally's inherited IRA, well, it has required distributions, and then it has to come out in a lump sum. We have the brokerage account assets. We're intentionally spending those down in their early retirement. Sally's deferred comp payout, that gets paid out, regardless. We don't have the ability within that account to choose which investment it gets paid from. And so I'll be talking about that in just a moment. And over here, we have our total account withdrawals. Now, while they're still working, they had a surplus, if you remember that first year. And so where did that surplus go? Well, they saved some in their non-retirement brokerage account. They had HSA contributions. And so here we have the total amount of what we call unspent withdrawals. And over here, we have their total cash flow available. So down the right-hand side, this is the gross of taxes, gross of Medicare Part B and D premiums that is available to this household. Now, where does it go? Well, this is part 2 of how it all fits together. So again, down the left-hand side, you see the calendar year. And this section E encompasses all the expenses and taxes that we looked at in their previous expense timeline, but grouped together to make it a little simpler to digest. So anything related to housing, their mortgage in the first 2 years, and then property taxes and upkeep are in the housing category. Living expenses, we see those. We see the periodic auto purchases. Other, this is charitable. No, this is not charitable. I'd have to go look up and see where my other category pulls in from. And then discretionary, I know this was some of their vacation spending. And then this is where I believe the charitable falls. And then we have anything related to medical in here. So that would encompass their insurance premiums, out-of-pocket, Part B and D premiums. And here we have their total outgoing cash flow, which again, we will see that this lines up exactly. So you can look at 284,300, 291,767. I can go back a slide, whoops, too far, and see how that lines up exactly with their incoming cash flow. Now, of course, when we're modeling software using spreadsheets, right, every dollar has to match. And in reality, for retirement, that is what we want to have happen, right? We want to know for every dollar I want to spend, I need to know where it's coming from, and I need to know how it was taxed so that I've appropriately accounted for that. Now, one thought on taxes, since we're looking out here and we can see this tax number, is that can be an adjustment for some people while you're working. Taxes are typically withheld from your paycheck. If you're self-employed, you're used to making quarterly tax payments, so the adjustment isn't quite as abrupt. But once you're retired, every year you will either need to have withholding from sources like IRAs or pensions or deferred comp, or you will need to do quarterly tax payments or sometimes a bit of both. And particularly if you're selling appreciated assets that have large embedded capital gains, you will want to plan for that. If you sell them in the first quarter of the year, but you didn't pay in enough throughout the year, you can be subject to underpayment penalties because this tax system is pay as you go. You're supposed to pay proportionately as you are earning the income. So if you have a Roth conversion or a realized gain early in the year and you didn't pay an extra, just know that could cause you some underpayment penalties. That used to be minor when interest rates were near zero, but with interest rates a little bit higher today, that underpayment penalty is an interest-based calculation, and so those penalties are a little higher in recent years than what we had seen in the past. Once you are taking IRA distributions, our preferred strategy now is to do all tax withholding from the IRA near year end. You got to earn interest on it all year long. And then at one point, just like it's just like when you're working, in our case, we custody at Schwab, we go in, we set the tax withholding, Schwab takes that amount, they pay it right to both federal and state, depending on what amounts we said. And I just said the IRS was a pay-as-you-go system. So how come we can do that? Well, when it's withheld directly from the IRA, it's kind of unique. The IRS looks at that as if it was paid in evenly throughout the year. What we like about it is people don't have to remember to go do their quarterly payments. I've had people, we send reminders, hey, your quarterly payment is due next week. Here, we're even sending the money to do it. And they've just forgot. Maybe they were planning on a vacation or they were packing or, something was going on with family life. And so we've had that numerous times where people just didn't pay the quarterly payments. And so now if we're doing it all through the IRA at year end, we like that a lot. It just makes it simple and convenient for everyone. And we know it was done. We know there's not going to be any surprises when they go file. Now, that only makes sense if we had planned IRA distributions anyway, right? So when you're paying taxes directly from the IRA, well, the amount that's paid for the tax is still a taxable distribution. So that's part of that iterative process. So, it's a lot. So I'm rushing through what we might cover in normally like 3 different meetings, over an hour each in 45 minutes. So I think I'm doing pretty good here. Let's look at how we test all of this. So I mentioned we want to know how to find that balance between spending today and what we call sequence of returns risk and what might happen later. And so one of the ways that you see modeled in a lot of different software programs is the Monte Carlo test. And this is testing just the financial portfolio. So here you're seeing the purple line, which is basically a fixed return of 5%. So if all your assets earned 5% each and every year, what would your trajectory look like? Well, we know in reality that's not how investments work. So the blue line represents a median. The green line represents the top 80% of outcomes tested. So it's a simulation of about 2,600 random different possible combinations of portfolio returns. And then the red line represents the worst 20%. Now, Nancy, who introduced us and who will join us for Q&A, reminded me of a critical aspect of this, which is that all 4 lines have an average 5% return. So when we talk about sequence of returns risk, over a 30-year time period, a portfolio can average a 5% internal rate of return, but it can go through times where that 5, 10 years where it is not quite averaging that. And so the red line has a 5% average rate of return and the green line has a 5% average rate of return. So because there's actual withdrawals coming out of the portfolio and the timing of when those withdrawals happened, it's hard for people to comprehend that both of those lines have the same average rate of return, but the timing of when the annual returns happened is what impacts the outcome. And then when we talk about sequence of returns risk, that is what we are talking about. It's why managing volatility and managing consistency of cash flow in retirement, it just takes far more importance than trying to hit a performance rate of return number. There's a researcher I like, Jim Sandage, who has a paper around chaos and retirement income, and he uses this example of a portfolio that was 100% stocks and earned, can't remember if it was 6 or 7% return and had no fees, and a portfolio that was 100% bonds and only earned about 4% and had fees, and the stock portfolio ran out of money and the other portfolio didn't. And you think, what? How on earth could that happen? And so it just, when you're actually withdrawing money every quarter, month, year, however you structure it, you are liquidating assets. You have to sell assets. And so you could have the investment itself had a great return the year later, but you had to liquidate part of that to live off of, because that's why you saved it in the first place. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But it can make the math not make as much common sense as it did when you're accumulating. Know that focusing purely on rate of return is the wrong metric when you're looking at retirement cash flows. So this is just one test that we like to use. It gives us a broad general sense of, does this plan work? We want to see an 80% success rate or higher. If you're testing every year, there's another researcher who, has a great paper on Michael Kitcey's Nerd's Eye View website, and he talks about the fact that if you're testing every year, you really only need a 50% success rate. We're a little conservative, so we like 80. You do not need a 100% success rate, at least not the way we do our Monte Carlo analysis. But every software package will have a different set or different methodology on how they do that. Plus, in life, there is not a 100% success rate guarantee of anything. That's my own personal philosophy. Then we have a fundedness test. Those of you who attend our webinars regularly have heard me talk about this. It's more like how a pension plan works. So if you ever worked at an employer that had a pension plan, you might get an annual notice. That annual notice, I hope my battery doesn't run dead. It's telling me it's low. All right, Nancy, if it runs dead, I don't know what we're going to do. So we'll figure it out. I'll run into the other room and plug in or something. That's weird because it looks like it is plugged in. Anyway, I digress. I'm going to speed talk now. So a fundedness test basically is looking at all the cash flows the plan has to pay out and all of the assets available to pay out that, and creating a present value calculation saying, well, how well funded is the plan based on these future cash flows? And we do that at a household level. So Wally and Sally here, we see that at the beginning of the year, they had $4.2 million in savings and investments. And then we looked at all of the cash flows, the present value of their cash flows discounted back to today's dollars at 4%. And we said, well, they would need about $3.3 million today, earning at least a 4% rate of return to meet those expenses plus taxes. And so they are in a positive funded. We want to see 110% or higher. We like this test to account for lumpy cash flows. It's more like a lifetime 4% rule, where in 1 year or early on, as we looked at, Wally and Sally said, we don't want to work till 65 or 70. Could we retire now? Absolutely. You're going to have to take out a little bit more, but your plan is still well funded. So we don't have to worry that the withdrawals are larger in the early years. And this allows us to take a look at that. And then the historical audit. Once we have all of the plan outlined by account, we run that through our investment partner, Asset Dedication, runs that through a historical model that says, well, if we had invested this way and taken these withdrawals, just as you have outlined them, what would have happened? And each one of the yellow lines represents an actual historical path. And so we can see a lot of the yellow lines. It's as if you retired in 1928 and then 1929 and then 1930, and each time ran your assets forward in time. We can see, a lot of those yellow paths are shooting up off the top of the screen where you would have had nothing to worry about. And then we have some primarily around the Great Depression era where the path yellow dipped significantly into the red before creeping back into the green, and then one or two where it followed the dotted white lines. The dotted white lines represent the minimum amount you would want to have for your plan to work for life. Now, in reality, we all get one yellow line, right? These are all the possible outcomes in history, and they can vary quite widely. We get one yellow line. And so if we're measuring as we go, and we have clients who are now 10 years into retirement and their yellow line is sitting up here significantly into the green, that's what allows us to say, yes, you can do these extra things, or you can take that trip, or you can buy that house, or you can do the remodel, or yes, you can buy a new car, whatever those things might be. And we don't have to wait until 10 years into retirement. Every year we're measuring where is that yellow line relative to the trajectory so that spending adjustments can be made along the way. And that's how we get as close as possible to that can I die with $1 in the bank. It's not really $1 because we need some reserves for some later life expenses. Then the very last part that we want to look at is how to align investments to the plan. And here is where we differ from the way that a lot of people do things. We want to think of each account as having its own unique job description and making sure the investments line up to that job description. And the way that we do that is with this withdrawal plan that you saw earlier. And so we went through each account, the timing of when assets were going to come out. And the ones highlighted in orange are the ones that we would say, okay, we want to secure those with something safe, a certificate of deposit, agency bonds, in some cases, municipal bonds, depending on the tax rate or the type of an account. But we don't want any equity market risk for the money that needs to support your cash flows in the next 5 to 8 years. And so in Wally's case, we have his pre-tax account. And so we might buy bonds maturing in 2032 and 2033, but the entire rest of Wally's pre-tax accounts would be invested in growth. Wally's IRA is a little different. We might buy something called bullet shares, which is a package of fixed bonds maturing each year for the first 4 years, and something like a low volatility fund to account for year 5, or we could go more conservative and keep that all in fixed income since we know it all has to come out and it will all be used for consumption in the fairly short time frame. 5 years is a pretty short time frame. The brokerage account, however, we're going to be taking some significant withdrawals from that. And because they inherited it, we were able to layer that into very secure, safe investments, agency, treasury bonds that are maturing each year. But this is where there's a balance if somebody has a lot of assets that have embedded gains in them, that we're going to have to do things a little differently or account for the taxes. And so sometimes the ideal withdrawal plan on paper has to be tweaked and adjusted based on the types of assets and the embedded tax implications that someone actually owns. Then we have the Roth IRAs. You see the balances up here. Well, we have no withdrawals coming for a long time from those. We see in year 20, we might start taking distributions from Wally's Roth. So those are going to start out invested 100% growth. And then we have Sally's deferred comp plan, which has a limited selection of choices, as most deferred comp plans do. And so we can't, with deferred comp plans and with many 401k plans, they make you take distributions pro rata. And so we're going to be looking for a particular fund type in Sally's deferred comp plan that's a low volatility fund. It might be one fund that has a very balanced approach, maybe 60% stocks, 40% bonds. Sometimes there's target date funds. So for example, if there was a target date 2030 or 2031 fund, usually they're not odd numbers like 2031, might be 2030. We might look at that. We would look at the underlying allocation of that fund and pick one that fit that 5-year timeline over which those assets were going to be distributed. So when you look at the household allocation, we often think of an allocation like the pie chart you're seeing at the top. That is just a simplification of 60% stocks, 40% bonds with growth in orange. We think of stocks or stock index funds as the growth category, safer choices, whether that would be bank savings, certificates of deposit, or bonds in the gray or fixed income category. But in reality, when you look underneath, the different accounts can be allocated very differently if they're actually aligned to the cash flow needs that are coming out of that account. So Wally's IRA would be closer to 72% in growth. The Roth IRAs, 100% growth. The brokerage account, almost all fixed income. And I made the deferred comp plan that kind of gray-orange color to signify that it would be a blend or a hybrid fund. The goal of this is a portfolio design that minimizes the range of outcomes. So if you think of that gray line with the arrow going across as the minimum desired outcome, I think of that minimum desired outcome in terms of cash flow needs. So in retirement, it's not portfolio volatility that we're worried about. It's cash flow stability. Which plan has the most likelihood of delivering the cash flows that I want over time? And so if that gray line was, well, that's what we want to have. And then you see the two orange bands going across. And that might be in a really horrible market economic scenario like the Great Recession, that particular 5 years coming out of that, yeah, maybe the orange line is a little bit below the gray line, but still acceptable. Maybe we'll do a little bit less travel, or we might put off some major home remodel expenses, but we're comfortable. We didn't have to go back to work. The top orange line, yes, there's a lot of room for upside in most market scenarios if we're very conservative or you're very conservative in your assumptions. As you start to deviate from a set of plans, adding in less predictable investments, adding more risk, focusing more on highest returns, that's where you start to expand the range of outcomes toward those red lines that you see, where yes, there can be certain strategies. I've seen people want to double down on their company stock, or, it could be Bitcoin when that came out. It could be gold right now. All of a sudden with gold at new highs, everyone's asking about gold. Yes, it could have the potential for higher or better outcomes, but it comes with the risk of a worst case outcome. And so you see the red lines represent a wider range of outcomes. And that's, for our particular approach, what we want to avoid. So we think in retirement, we want a portfolio design and a plan design that narrows the range of outcomes and still allows for upside. But what we're primarily focused on is strategies that are most likely to deliver sustainable, predictable cash flow and reduce the potential of a more catastrophic outcome. So our battery only needed to last like 10 more minutes. But that wraps up the bulk of our presentation. We are going to open it up for Q&A, but very quickly, I have a new book coming out. Our estimated time of arrival is spring of this year. It's called Living Off Your Acorns, Your Guide to the 4 Phases of Retirement. And so I will walk through in that book, the pre-go phase, go, slow go, and no-go, what you need to think about both from a financial standpoint and a psychological standpoint, behavioral standpoint, as you move through those phases. And then our next webinar is going to be March of 2026, where I will tie into some of the content coming out in that book and really talk about how you plan more strategically for these 4 phases. With that, Nancy, do you want to open it up? I know I've seen tons of questions pouring in while we were out. Some of them might have been comments while we were offline.
I can hear typing. As I was typing madly, Megan, quick, can you run into the market?
Yes.
We do have a lot of questions. So if you're ready, I would be happy to
go for it. Normally, I can kind of see the questions and read along, but I'm not going to try that now because I might knock myself offline again.
Not a good idea. All right. So bear with me one second. I'll start kind of at the bottom. What is your opinion about how likely it is that the Social Security retirement benefits will have to be decreased due to a lack of funding?
I think it's highly unlikely. The Social Security system makes up the foundation of most people's retirement plans, but particularly when you're looking at the lower income, lower net worth demographics, if they were to see a reduction in their Social Security benefits, the government has to cover that gap one way or another. Most people in the lower net worth, net income, retirement debt segments would be in poverty or even close to poverty with Social Security. So when you look at just politically, I don't think they're going to make changes until they absolutely have to, until the last minute. But I think it would be very, very unlikely that we're going to see substantial benefit cuts. There's been numerous proposals out there that show how that they could make the system sustainable. We went through the exact same thing in the early 1980s. The system was months supposedly away from running out, and they came through with a whole set of changes that were implemented slowly over the coming decade. It's how we got to the graduated full retirement age schedule that we have today, and that was considered a 50-year fix at the time to bring the system into solvency. And I would think we're going to see something similar. I just unfortunately don't think they're going to act on it until they have to. I think because they have the ability to act on it at the last minute, the media can take the situation and, oh my gosh, the system's going bankrupt, and case that's probably not really the reality. So the way these things are framed, and then the political reality of them knowing, hey, we could wait till 3 months before and tweak these things and it would be fine. It causes chaos. So I feel very confident it will be there for us. And it's frustrating the way that it happens.
Do you see the 4% rule for withdrawal as too conservative?
I do think it's very conservative, and it's those of you who might have read my post. It did an interview with Bill Bengen, who was the father of the 4% rule. He never meant it to be a rule. I talk about that in the blog post. And also, this is an episode that we cover on our Making Retirement Make Sense podcast. There's a whole episode on the 4% rule where I deep dive on this. So that's about an hour. You can go listen to that. But in that episode, I talk about, the fact that Bill himself said it was never meant to be a rule. It started off as, I believe, 4.17 or 4.15, but then he rounded down to 4.1 because the 4.17 seemed to imply too high a level of precision that he never meant to indicate. And then the media rounded it down to 4 to make it more digestible, more easily digestible. And then what I see consumers do is then they round it down even more. And so by the time you've gone through all those iterations, it ends up being far more conservative than it was ever intended. Bengen has done a lot of research and come out with a new book that I believe we have it sitting, I actually have it within reach. So called A Richer Retirement. And it's supercharging the 4% rule to spend more and enjoy more. And so in that book, he now makes the argument that 5% is a sustainable, safe withdrawal rate. The reality is there is no set it and forget it, right? We like an ongoing methodology to retest every year, and that allows for this more dynamic process. And it allows people to typically spend more than if they were going to start with some kind of rule and then try to follow that rule for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. How does one know if most of your income is from volatile stocks and bonds? One day you have $1 million and next week it could be $500,000. So I think the question is really about how do you manage income if it's coming from things that are going up and down?
Yeah, I mean, the way we do it is exactly what I just illustrated in this webinar. So we lay out these projection models, and then of course, let's say you have $1 million. Well, you're not using all that million at once. So let's just say you're taking 50,000 out a year, and so we have 50,000 times 5, so 250,000 is in CDs or bonds that are maturing each year. Well, that part that you're withdrawing from is not subject to those equity market fluctuations. So a lot of the sequence of returns risk is that I have to take a withdrawal during one of those down years. But by structuring the portfolio more strategically, so here's the piece that's maturing when I need it, well, I don't have to worry about that for that piece. And then this longer term piece, the rest that's in the growth assets, well, when we are having some very strong equity returns like now, we are actively selling growth and replenishing some of the fixed income that we've used for consumption. And so it's not an annual rebalancing process. It's a process where each account is aligned to the withdrawals that it needs to sustain, and then the underlying assets are aligned to that timeline. That is our preferred way of doing it. Some people just set up systematic withdrawals and they pro rata withdraw out of stocks and bonds proportionately, and over time, in a lot of market scenarios, just let that volatility play out as it will, and that it often works. It's just not, to us, it's not something we're quite as comfortable with.
Yeah. This year, we hear a lot about the importance of adding gold or gold funds to retirement portfolios, like last year and before Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies were all the rage. People whose portfolios consist of stocks and bonds, bond funds, and cash doomed? Also, should we take the crisis with Japan's bonds as big noise, or should it be a concern for those who are very close to retiring?
So each portfolio asset allocation will have a model and a set of underlying metrics that it's built on. And so it's really hard to answer those questions because, there's not one answer, right? It would depend on the goals and objectives of that portfolio model. If I were looking at a portfolio model of equities where the primary objective was managing 1-year volatility, then commodity assets like gold can add value. Now, they may actually reduce the sustainability of that portfolio over long periods of time, but if my primary objective was managing 1-year volatility, they could add a lot of value. And so people often look at what's in the news and it becomes a little bit more of I'm going to swing into this and swing into that. That is not a portfolio strategy or a portfolio model, right? That is a kind of, the wind blew this way, so I think I'll do that. The wind blew this way, so I think I'll do that. A portfolio model has a goal and an objective and a set of risk and return metrics, and it's designed around achieving a particular outcome over time. We like a portfolio model designed around long-term outcomes because in retirement, if your portfolio does really well, that's not a risk, that you're going to be fine. We want something that helps reduce the downside volatility. And so there's a certain set of asset classes we use that do involve stocks and bonds, and it's worked quite well. The number one performing asset class in our portfolios last year was international small cap, a fund that was up over 47%. So did I have to have gold to have something in my portfolio that did really well? No. Unfortunately, a lot of people didn't have exposure to international or emerging market asset classes, which are doing really, really well. If you have a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds, no, I don't think people are doomed at all. But if you have only the S&P 500 and a total return bond fund, that could be problematic, right? Because if interest rates, were to go up again, your total return bond fund's going to go down. If the S&P run, it tends to come in runs, right? We had a great decade. If that decade is, over, you're going to see other asset classes that do really well over the next 10 years. What happened in the last 10 years isn't going to be what happens in the next 10 years. And so I think it's just critical that people understand what is your portfolio structure designed around, and then you stick with that. It's like driving down the highway. Like, I don't want to constantly change lanes trying to get in the fastest lane. Oftentimes you end up farther and farther behind. You want to have one sustainable strategy that will get you safely to where you need to go.
4% rule followers wouldn't be thrilled to see Sally and Wally's total outflows in Dana's model. The couple's net worth without primary residence is a little over $4 million, so it's almost a 7% withdrawal. This is a great time to talk about because it is different depending on what's going on. What's the asset allocation of their portfolio, and is this withdrawal rate sustainable?
Well, I think I went through that in the webinar, right? That is the withdrawal early on, but then when Social Security starts in, that withdrawal rate goes down, right? And yes, it's perfectly sustainable. That's why we did those 3 retirement readiness tests, right? So we did the fundedness test, the Monte Carlo test, and the historical audit to determine if that exact path was sustainable. Those tests weren't disconnected from the plan. Those weren't tests on some portfolio structure that had nothing to do with Wally and Sally. That was Wally and Sally's exact net worth, exact cash flows, exact assets run through these series of tests to say, is this a sustainable path? And so by all measures, yes, it is sustainable. Now, it's also retested and adjustments can be made along the way. But we have plans now. Well, I have plans I did over 20 years ago where I can go see the path that was laid out and then see how reality played out. And it's amazing how close they can be. But we would feel 100% comfortable with that set of withdrawals. That's why I don't like the 4% rule. your plan can often sustain much higher withdrawals, not for the life of the plan, but for certain years, or if you're going to retire early and then the withdrawal is going to be lower later. Oftentimes that is perfectly sustainable. And we saw in their trajectory, they actually maintain their asset value using a very conservative set of assumptions over their retirement lifestyle. So research shows that a lot of people are just going to end up with far more wealth at the end of retirement than they had at retirement, because they're taking these rules, which can be great rules when you're far away from retirement, but they're not necessarily the right rules to use once you're actually there and making these decisions. And they're just applying them, robotically, and they're just going to see their assets grow throughout retirement. And that's fine if that's what you want. But there are a lot of people who are leaving spending and lifestyle choices and experiences on the table where it would be perfectly okay for them to do that.
Yeah. I think too, when we look at the different phases, the go-go, the slow-go, the no-go, it may be something off in the distance, like it hasn't really hit. But once you kind of get there, you start to appreciate that the go-go years are not ongoing. Like there's a point where they're going to be over, and you're in the slow-go years. So how can you safely spend more and do more and make the most of those go-go years? And sometimes that will require more in the way of withdrawals.
Yep.
You just want to make sure that it's done safely.
Yes.
All of my IRAs are Roth. I have bought companies that pay dividends. I'm assuming the dividends are not taxable, correct? Yet they are. They are not. I could have just responded directly. Sorry. The Social Security discussion. So, as a married couple delaying until 70, what if the high income spouse unexpectedly dies before 70? Does the other spouse have access to the higher Social Security?
They do up until the age at which that person passed. So if they passed at 68, the surviving spouse could claim their benefit, what it would have been at 68.
Any suggestions or specific considerations for couples retiring much earlier with an 8-year age difference?
I'm trying to think of specific considerations. I mean, those are the cases where we're definitely modeling out withdrawals. So if you're retiring much earlier, if you're, under age 59 and a half, the considerations are what assets are you going to tap for spending? If you're not tapping the pre-tax retirement accounts yet, or if you're setting up a certain set of 72T payments out of those. You do have a longer time horizon there. So when one couple is 8 years older, sometimes we see Social Security claiming strategies that are atypical. I have seen strategies where the oldest spouse does not delay till 70 in those situations, where the youngest spouse delays till 70. It depends on your income differential. It's really hard to answer that one on a blanket. So much of it depends on who was the higher earner, the character of your assets. Certainly whether you're eligible for the healthcare tax credit comes into play when you're retiring earlier. Now you have one spouse going on Medicare 8 years before the other. So I can think of all kinds of things, but it's impossible to give any specific answers without, actually running that model out.
Yeah. Two-parter for long-term care expenses. So first is, why didn't you model the long-term care expenses? And the second is, if you model long-term care expenses, what age would you use to start the expenses?
Yeah, we do have them modeled in a different part of the spreadsheet that we just, too much to go into. But we model them a little differently, right? The research shows that about 15% of households are going to incur significant long-term care expenses. So for us to model in this event for 100% of households as if they are going to happen doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we model them in by looking at what reserves are available. So we look at the onset of the expense in the early 80s, so between 80 and 85. And, if it's a single, it's pretty easy. We're using an expense of $300 a day in today's dollars, but we've inflated that so that it's significantly more by the time they reach 80 or 85. And then we look at, how many years of that expense could their plan cover? And we want a minimum of 5, which is significantly higher than the average stay. And in most cases, we see numbers that are, it could be covered for the rest of their life. And so then we know that they're in good shape for long-term care. If it's a couple, we'll model it a little differently. We'll model it as if one spouse incurs long-term care expenses, typically the older spouse first, and the other spouse remains healthy and at home. And that would often be the most expensive scenario where we need to cover $300 a day for assisted living or, full assistance, inflated, of course. And then we have to cover a full lifestyle for the healthy spouse. And so again, we'll model all of that out and say, well, based on their net worth and their total assets, how many years of that would be covered by their early 80s? And then we have discussions around that. And in most cases, we're going, you are well covered for any long-term care event. But there are cases, if there's insurance or if there's a lump sum long-term care annuity insurance policy, then we're also modeling that in and saying, well, here's the total assets available to meet this expense, and here's the insurance available to meet this expense, and what does that look like?
If Wally and Sally are in the 24% bracket, but have an effective tax rate of 18.5, what should Wally's inherited IRA withholding be?
Well, the question is really, would we even do withholding on Wally's inherited IRA, right? Because it's only about $5,000 a year and they have significant other income. So even if I were to withhold 18% on federal taxes on that, it's not going to be very much. And so we look at it a little different. We don't do withholding on each, income type. We would either set up quarterly payments throughout the year, or we might withhold all of Wally's IRA. So we could do 100% of it to taxes because their tax liabilities, I believe it was like $50,000, and they're doing a Roth conversion. And so we might say, we're going to just withhold 100% of Wally's IRA to taxes because you're going to have to pay those taxes one way or the other. And so, if it was a different kind of case, I would use about 18% if I was withholding, directly, from each different source. But typically that's not how we do it.
Is it a good idea to leave some funds in a taxable IRA versus converting to a Roth IRA for long-term expenses? And I don't know if it's long-term care expenses or just expenses over the long term.
I mean, it's really more around tax rates today and your estimated tax rates later about how much you convert. We have seen cases where people over-convert. There's this big, zero tax plan, which often doesn't make sense when you look at the standard deduction. I mean, you're going to be able to have so much income each year that's not subject to tax anyway, especially with some of the increased standard deduction changes that we've seen. And right now, for a few years, we have the increased senior bonus deduction that's in place. So I don't think over-converting makes sense. And then you have the factor that if you do have significant medical expenses, those become an itemized deduction, and that deduction can often offset some higher IRA withdrawals that you might have. And so I don't like the idea of converting everything to a Roth and then only having the Roth to cover those expenses later.
This is going to be kind of a two-parter, two different questions of two different people. Since I believe you're not operating like the Red Cross, what are the fees for the service provided by Sensible Money? And the other is, where is the line item for the cost of financial planning? And I would also maybe wrap in there, Juicing Plus if.
Yeah. So, we're in the middle of converting our service model. For the last decade, we have done, kind of a two-tiered service model where everybody does a plan, and that is for a fee. And then a significant portion of those roll into our ongoing service where it's based on an assets under management rate, and we do the planning every single year. And we are slowly phasing out our plan-only service, so we will only be working with ongoing clients. And so it's based on an asset under management rate. The higher the amount of assets, the lower that rate goes. And so that is built into the portfolio returns that we use in our modeling. So we have a whole slide where we explain, we start with a hypothetical 60-40 portfolio. What did it do in the last decade? Earned about 6.5%. If we subtracted out 1.5% a year in management fees, then even in the worst decade, the portfolio's averaged 5% after fees. Our fees aren't 1.5%, but again, that's
Yeah.
how we like to model it. And so that's already factored in the, into the return modeling that we use in that plan.
Any considerations for two individual lifetime partners who are not married but would be willing to marry if it meant a better financial retirement? And I'm thinking of a couple of situations where that question was asked, and that's what we helped them decide.
We have had many of those cases. It's more complex because you're each at single tax rates, and then the Social Security survivor benefit aspect that we're talking about doesn't apply. And so in many cases, from a purely financial standpoint, it does make sense to get married. Matter of fact, we've had numerous situations where people went through the modeling, looked at it both ways, and decided to get married in that situation. I can't guarantee that is the right thing, of course, in your situation, but it is a common situation that we see.
Can you clarify why you prefer to use a bond ladder instead of short-term or intermediate ETFs or mutual funds for the next 5 to 8 years of living expenses?
Yeah, I mean, the short-term ETFs, if you're matching the duration of the fund with the expected timing of the withdrawal from that fund, those can work. But you have share price fluctuation. And there are also tax reasons that we like individual bonds. So treasury bonds, for example, in a brokerage account are not taxed at the state level. So for clients in higher state tax rates, that can be an advantage. You can have municipal bonds for super high tax rate clients in brokerage accounts. And then in the retirement portfolios, we can have CDs and agencies. And we just find that we know exactly what we're going to get when that bond matures. We know when the coupon payments are coming in. And we like that versus the fluctuation that you can see even in the short-term ETFs, bond ETFs. When interest rates rise suddenly, we saw some significant downside volatility in those funds. And if that happens right when I'm taking your annual distribution, that's not why I want that part of the portfolio. I want to know exactly what I'm going to get and when I'm going to get it.
This is something that we hear not infrequently. I'm recently retired and would like to know how to counter the lifelong habit of saving, namely spending. I don't want to be in my no-go years when I finally break the habit.
Such a wonderful, wonderful question. So thank you for asking, for having the courage to ask that question. I know you're anonymous, but it's not an easy thing to ask. I talk a lot about this in my upcoming book, Living Off Your Acorns. It is a challenge, right? You do have this lifelong habit of saving. And I've seen people who have visceral fear of taking a portfolio withdrawal. There's a great book called Die with Zero that we often recommend people read that can help you understand, how money is simply a tool to align with your values and experiences in life. And we've seen people get a little more comfortable after reading that book. You can't take it with you. This is something, I even try to tell myself. I turned 55 this year, and in certain spending decisions, it's like, I don't have children either. My husband and I, neither of us have children. And so there's this ingrained sense of wanting to accumulate more and wanting to see that net worth and those account balances go up. But ultimately, either I'm going to decide where that money goes or someone else is going to decide. And so it's really for you to work through, I don't want to suggest a, coaching or a therapist, but whatever you need to do to figure out, how do you get comfortable making those decisions? And oftentimes we have had experiences growing up. Myself, my mom filed bankruptcy twice growing up. My parents were divorced when I was 3. I remember clearly them coming into our house. I was somewhere between the age of 9 and 11, taking our microwave, repossessing the furniture, my stepdad's car getting repossessed. And so those leave a deep, deep impression on us. And I've worked with many clients who have at some point said, almost like confessing that they grew up really poor. And it's like doing that internal work, whatever you need to do to really come to peace with that was the past, and where are you at today, and how are things different, and how do you really know you're going to be okay?
Yeah. Should we be concerned about the stability of the US dollar? Many countries are showing their displeasure of recent US policies by dumping treasuries. How likely is it that the US dollar can be replaced as the world's reserve currency? Should we also diversify into other currencies? If so, which ones? How would it affect investing?
I don't think you should be concerned if you have a diversified portfolio to start with. And so again, we've seen, international emerging assets, market assets classes do extraordinarily well as the dollar has declined. So again, if you're maintaining a diversified portfolio, there should be nothing significant you need to do. I think we are a long way off from the dollar losing its reserve status currency. I've been hearing this question for, probably well over a decade now, maybe even 15 years. And it kind of comes and goes depending on what's in the news, whether the question, kind of gets asked more frequently or not. But, Ray Dalio, if you're a fan of his, he has some interesting videos and books out there on this too. I don't think we're going to see it certainly not in my lifetime, but that's not to say it could never happen.
What percentage of your assets do you think should be in Roth accounts?
So there's not really a percentage, right? Because, I like what I call tax account diversification. And so it's nice to see that, people have in retirement different buckets they can pull from. But it's really a matter of your income while you're working, whether you're eligible to contribute to Roths, whether you have the ability to contribute to Roths within your employer-funded accounts, whether there's a window of time where Roth conversions make sense. And so you're following those metrics to see what you can reasonably get into Roths. But we have clients that have no money in Roths, and their tax rates are such that it doesn't make sense to convert. They're not eligible to contribute, and it will never make sense to convert to Roth IRAs. So it's really impossible to turn that into a percentage.
Mm-hmm. So this comes up, has come up a few times. So I'll address a couple of questions. One is, any chance we could get the slides, and the other is, will a replay be available? So we don't send out the slides as such, but on the replay, there's nothing to stop anyone from screenshotting, right? And so saving any of the screens that they'd like to there, and we absolutely will send a replay. So.
And on that note, we're not sure yet where this webinar is going to get posted. So will it be on our Sensible Money YouTube channel, or will it go to our new Making Retirement Make Sense channel? We're not sure, but if you are registered for this webinar, we will be sending out the link, so you'll know where to find it.
If we have significant taxable accounts with embedded capital gains and that we may not spend, and if we are happy with the funds that we've picked and don't want to sell them, can we still be a fit to your firm?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it really is just a matter of, in your plan, if withdrawals are needed from that account type. We have some clients where we have worked through charitable remainder trusts, charitable annuity trusts, contributing to donor advised funds with appreciated assets, just part of their legacy strategy. So those assets will get a step up in basis when they pass along. It's, your goals, your plan. We talk about your money, your values, your plan. So absolutely. And then it's working through the assets that you have and figuring out how they align to that plan.
Are the slides similar to the work product we would receive if we went through the juicing process?
Yes. And so that is the exact model that we use. We like to break it out over several more meetings because I, sped through it all to try to fit it into an hour. But we think of, a series of meetings. We call them, strategy 1, where we're really just general outline of expenses and income and kind of, does this plan work? That's where we run the Monte Carlo test. Strategy 2 is where we're fine-tuning decisions such as your Social Security claiming strategy, pension claiming, whether Roth conversions work, what your tax strategy is. So I think of that as like taking that radio dial and dialing it in to see, is there a way to improve the plan, not with investment outcomes, but with planning decisions. And then strategy 3 is then where we're aligning the investments to the plan. So here's what a portfolio would look like if it's now lined up with the cash flows that it's going to need to deliver.
Yeah. And I should know this, I apologize. When is your book coming out again?
Well, I don't know, so you shouldn't know it, Nancy, because I don't know. It was completed last September, and this final stage is like pulling teeth of, editing and bullet points and margins, and oh my goodness, it's the kind of stuff that is so tedious. And so we're working through all of that right now. Once that part is done, they tell us there's like this month-long pre-launch phase. We are thinking March. So I'm very hopeful that, mid-March, hopefully no later than the end of March.
That's kind of was what I was thinking. What is the amount of QCDs that we can give?
So it's up to 100,000. I believe that is adjusted with inflation. Do you know that off the top of your head, Nancy?
It's 118, I think.
118 now. Yeah.
I haven't hit the limit yet.
We haven't had any clients hit that limit yet, but yeah. No. So it starts when you're 70 and a half, even though required minimum distributions don't start now till 73 or 75. Your ability to do qualified charitable distributions starts at age 70 and a half. And when these first came about, it was $100,000 a year you could do as a charitable distribution, but that has been indexed to inflation. So we think it's around $118,000 today is the maximum amount. Now, you cannot do those out of qualified plans like 401ks. So that's always a consideration if you've left your assets in your employer plan.
Yeah. And you want to make sure that you take those first before the required distributions if you want it to count.
Yes. So you need to take any charitable distribution out first, and then you will have your remaining, if you are RMD age, your remaining required distribution amount that comes out second.
Yeah. So is there such a professional position, someone who can help an individual determine who to leave their assets to in a will, someone a person can chat with outside of family? This has actually come up a few times recently for me with folks.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's another really good question. There are professional fiduciaries that are people outside of family that can act as, your successor, or your executor, your successor trustee. There are your financial advisors, if you have a person who will often help walk you through those conversations, who is important to you, what are the causes you care about. And then you could try coaches, therapists, some of more of like maybe a life coach type person who can help figure out how to ask you the right questions to help bring those answers out. But this is another one that I think about for myself. Because I have nieces and nephews, but I don't have children. And so in thinking through, ultimately, where do I want whatever is left over? Where do I want that to go? It's going to take a lot of thinking, and it may change over time. So what I want or think might happen today may be different than what I think when I'm 80 or 85.
Yeah. Does your firm have a minimum investment amount that you will work with?
We don't. We have a minimum annual fee of $12,500 that typically equates to a minimum asset amount of $1 million. But we have had clients come in, their bulk of their assets are in qualified plans. They might be in their last year or two of work, who pay the minimum fee on a quarterly basis, even though all of their assets aren't able to be managed yet.
Once the potential outcomes are run using Monte Carlo analysis, is the output fixed for planning purposes, or is it updated with a determined frequency?
Ask that again. Something about Monte Carlo is the first part of the question.
Yeah. Once Monte Carlo results appear, so maybe the initial run, is that output fixed or is it ever updated?
Nope, nothing's fixed. Sometimes I wish it was. But no, it's a living, breathing, I've had people where we run this, tweak that, click a button, rerun Monte Carlo. Okay, let's try this, click a button, rerun Monte Carlo. Now, there are times where we don't think that's the most appropriate of the 3 tests to use. We like the fundedness test as a more living, breathing, usable, but it's as easy as click of a button if we changed expenses to rerun the Monte Carlo. And every year it's updated based on new balances, right? So, here is what we have, assuming everything earned 5%. Well, in most cases, the portfolios actually did better than that because we want to be super conservative in our projections. It's always better to have reality end up a little bit better, right? So we want to plan as if the worst case happens and know that, hopefully something better than worst case happens. And so we're updating that every year, and often those metrics are improving over time, which is what enables us to feel confident in telling people, yes, you can spend more, or yes, you can go on that trip, or yes, you can buy that car.
Are you good for a couple more questions?
Sure.
Okay. When should one stop contributing to deferred retirement accounts like 401ks and IRAs?
Well, it's a great question too. So there's a couple different layers of that. One, your plan could be sufficiently funded. So you may still plan on working a few more years, but you don't need to save anymore. And so that could be a reason to stop. 2, you might still want to save more in those plans if it simply made sense for taxes, right? You're still being able to deduct that contribution at a higher tax rate than you would pay when you withdraw it later. 3, there can be asset protection reasons. So if you're in a high risk profession, medical profession perhaps, or a business owner where you think your risk of being sued is higher, as you're funding those tax deferred qualified plans, there's an additional layer of asset protection there. And so that could be a reason to keep funding those plans. So you'd have to look at all 3 of those criteria.
Yeah. And my apologies, Dana, I misled you. 118 is some other limit or something.
Back on the qualified charitable.
Someone just pointed out that it's 111,000 for 2026.
111,000 for 2026. Thank you for looking that up for us.
And so if it's a couple, each spouse can contribute 111, which would bring it to a total of 222.
Great.
Does your company offer tax planning services separately from investment planning and advice? It says located near your South Carolina offices. So I'm here in South Carolina, but really the headquarters, everything kind of happens out of Scottsdale. So that would be local. But maybe just talk about the planning services.
Yeah, no, it's all integrated. We don't do tax planning separately. It's one of the most time-consuming pieces of what we do, and that's even when we have readily access to the information, tax returns and the portfolio realized gains and losses and unrealized gains and losses year to date. And then we find that if we were trying to do that without access to all that information, we don't have the resources to do that. There is a shortage of both accountants and financial advisors. And it's putting a constraint on, the ability of firms, not just like ours, but all across, to be able to offer services. So, if you're seeing, changes in service models or minimum fees rise, it's because literally in our case, it takes 5 years, a college degree plus 2 additional credentials for someone to be able to serve as an executive financial planner and really have the knowledge base and the experience, like a doctor going through a residency program, right? They've partnered up with a more experienced planner for a number of years now before they can in what we feel confidently lead retirement plans. And so you can't hire someone out of school and 90 days later have them on the phones, right? It's not like calling the number where, you get put on hold, no one can answer your question, and then you get rolled up to someone. And so you are seeing that, across the industry right now is there is definitely a constraint of available talent and knowledgeable people to do this kind of work.
What we do not do would be tax returns.
Correct.
And I'm wondering if that's part of the tax planning services that is the part of the question.
Correct. We do not do tax returns. We, partner with CPAs or often work with the accountant of the client's choice to help make sure that whatever was planned is in fact reported correctly. And we often review returns, again, in hindsight, to make sure that everything got reported the way we thought it should be. But we don't do actual tax returns.
Okay. And maybe this will be the last one. There's some others that are different iterations of questions that have been already asked and I think answered. So this is, yay, finally a new book from Dana. Will no idea, we've all been saying that. Will the book contain any spreadsheets, math to show the logic like Dana did in her previous books?
Yes. I'm so happy you asked that question. So yes, matter of fact, something very similar to what we looked at today, the vertical format where I showed part 1 and part 2, how it all fits together. I have an example like that in the book, probably much to my publisher's dismay. I don't think they expected to have all this technical stuff thrown in with the more behavioral, psychological transition stuff. But I think both are important. And so obviously whoever asked this question is a numbers person at heart, like I am. And so I had to show all of the numbers and what a cash flow plan looks like. So yes, there is that example in there.
Okay, great. Well, that will, I think that will wrap for today.
Nancy, thank you so much. All of the people who stayed on till the end. We had almost 1,000 people registered. So these webinars have definitely grown. Thanks, everybody. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Making Retirement Make Sense. If you found it helpful, please like, subscribe, comment, and share it with someone who you feel could benefit from what we discussed today. And if you're feeling extra generous, we'd welcome a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.